I always intended to make two films about the impunity and the fear that has been the legacy of the Indonesian genocide of 1965. And the origin of those two films, there's one scene which was really the birth of those two films, the birth of that idea, and it comes again and again, plays several times in The Look of Silence. And it's two men from neighboring villages, two death squad leaders, who take me to a spot on North Sumatra's, Indonesia's Snake River, where they walk me down a road, taking turns playing victim and perpetrator, and reenacting or demonstrating with apparent glee how they killed 10,500 people at one little clearing. And then at the end of this terrible walk to the river, they start talking about how they killed my friend's son, Ramli. And it's that family, Ramli's family, which is at the center of The Look of Silence. And then they take out a little point-and-shoot camera and pose for photographs as souvenirs of this happy afternoon out. And I had this awful feeling that over the course of that walk, that it's as though I'd wandered into Germany 40 years after the Holocaust, only to find the Nazis still in power. And it's not because of the crimes that were committed in 1965, and not because of the boasting, which I'd already probably spent nearly a year filming other perpetrators doing. What was special was I brought two perpetrators who didn't know each other before together to see if they would boast to each other the same way they boasted to me. Or because certainly it was possible that they would warn the other. One would warn the other, you shouldn't speak this way, it'll get us in trouble. On the contrary, they were trying to outdo each other in boasting. They were trying to best each other in the boasting, and it was as though they were reading from a shared script. And that's when I understood the boasting was systemic and without any doubt not a symptom of these men being psychopaths, but a symptom of terrible political impunity. And that's when I knew I would make two films. And I knew pretty much within hours, I knew there'd be two films. One of them would be, I understood, about the lies that the perpetrators tell themselves, the stories they tell themselves so they could live with themselves, and the tragic consequences of imposing those on the whole society. I knew that would, of course, be a film about storytelling, fantasy, escapism, and guilt. And consequently, it would have to be a kind of flamboyant fever dream of a film. That's The Act of Killing. But I knew I would make a second, equally urgent film, equally contemporary film, also about the present, also not about the events of 1965 per se, about the terrible toll on ordinary people, and especially survivors, of living for 50 years in fear and in silence. People often see The Look of Silence and The Act of Killing and they ask, how on earth did you get these people to speak so openly? And in fact, both films are a response to that openness and were not a lure or a trick to get people to open up. You see, when the survivors back in 2003 first asked me to try and film the perpetrators, I was reluctant. I was afraid. I thought it could be dangerous. But when I approached them, immediately they would open up, every single one. All I would do is ask, what did you do for a living? And within seconds, I would be hearing the most grisly details of mass murder, recounted with smiles on by the perpetrators with smiles on their faces, often in front of their wives, their children, even their small grandchildren. And so to get people to open up about the crimes was very easy. It required nothing. Now, to get people to open up about their feelings regarding the crimes was another matter, and but that's not something that involved no special skill. That's the same. All I had to do was to approach the perpetrators as human beings, to resist the temptation of making the leap from saying these men have done something monstrous to these men are monsters, because I knew to do that would be to just reassure myself that I'm not like them. Whereas, in fact, I would hope that I wouldn't do the same things they did if I grew up in their families at that time. But I know I'm very lucky never to have to find out. And essentially, all you have to do to get people, anybody, perpetrator or ordinary person, to open up about their feelings, to open up as a human being, is to approach them as a human being, with empathy, with respect, and with an open heart. People who've seen The Act of Killing will often ask, weren't you afraid making the film? And to be honest, that was an emotionally frightening film to make. But The Look of Silence was a physically frightening film to make. When Adi said he wanted to approach the perpetrators and confront them, I had to think, how can we do this safely? And I understood that perhaps if we worked from the lowest ranking perpetrator up the chain of command, and we worked swiftly, so we do another confrontation every day. If I shot only with a Danish crew. If Adi didn't bring any ID, so that if we were detained, they would have trouble figuring out who he is by the time we got help from an embassy. If we had his family at the airport ready to evacuate in case there was any danger, and if we had a getaway car so that it was harder to follow us, if we should need to run away, then we might just about be able to get through this without being physically harmed. So we took all of those precautions. And then, of course, Adi's family, from the very beginning, it was a long discussion, understood that they would have to move to another area, another region, so that they would avoid the political and repercussions of the courageous work that the family's done by making this film. I made The Look of Silence because I felt it's important to have a film that shows what it does to human beings to have to live for 50 years in fear, in unresolved trauma, in silence, surrounded by the still powerful death squad leaders who murdered their families. Imagine you have to go to school, send your children to school every day to be taught by the people who killed their older siblings, your older children. Imagine you have to go to the market and meet the people who killed your children. Imagine you have to go to weddings and funerals and socialize politely with people who murdered your children because you're too afraid to actually speak out and confront them. That takes a tremendous toll on our humanity, on what it means to be human, and on our ability to grieve and mourn and heal. And I wanted to make a film that stands really in memoriam for all that's destroyed. That's why I made The Look of Silence. My first film, The Act of Killing, really helped to catalyze a fundamental transformation in how Indonesia talks about its past. The media talks about the genocide as a genocide. The public talk about the terrifying consequences of impunity for the killers with an openness that they didn't dare to adopt before. They now speak about the corruption, the thuggery, the use of gangsters by politicians, all of which goes back to the mass killings of 1965 and the fact that everyone was so afraid and traumatized as a result. Now, into that space opened by The Act of Killing comes my new film, The Look of Silence. The Act of Killing was released in secret in Indonesia, but The Look of Silence is released publicly, openly, sponsored by two government bodies, the National Human Rights Commission and the Jakarta Arts Council. That in itself represents the change that the Act of Killing helped to bring about. The film, on the first day of screenings, screened 500 times simultaneously across the country. A few weeks later, there'd been 2,500 screenings. Into that space opened by the Act of Killing came The Look of Silence and look how torn the social fabric in Indonesia is. Look how urgently we need truth, justice, reconciliation, and some form of healing. And look at Adi's dignified, humane example to show how that might be possible, how we might actually be able to achieve that. Outside Indonesia, I hope that the film will serve not so much to expose an intolerable situation over there, but be a mirror to all of us that makes us ask, how are we complicit in impunity? Not just for all sorts of wrong, not just in Indonesia, because our government in the United States was involved with supporting the Indonesian killers and the regime that came to power through it. But also, how are we complicit with impunity for across the world and at home? What really inspires me as a filmmaker is the fact that cinema becomes this life calling that invites me to explore the world. I don't see myself primarily as a storyteller. I see myself as an explorer. I see myself as taking a journey into the most painful, mysterious, complicated parts of what we are through filmmaking, through the journeys I take with the people in my film, whether it's Anwar Congo in The Act of Killing or Adi Rukun in The Look of Silence. And I hope by the end of the journey, all of us are different people than we were at the start. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here when I say this. I'm not really saying anything totally original. Not only sort of older filmmakers like the French master Jean Rouch, but who coined the term cinema verite, but also Werner Herzog and Errol Morris, two filmmakers who I think I wouldn't be a filmmaker without Werner Herzog's work. And I'm not necessarily talking about the obvious connection between his documentary work and mine. I'm thinking of the fever dream of his cinema. Films like Even Dwarfs Started Small, Nosferatu, Strozek, Wojciech, Aguirre, Wrath of God, and more recent works like My Son, What Have You Done? I love Werner's someone who has taught me that there's no limit to the wildness that's possible in cinema, so long as you can have a rigorous vision. And Errol is someone who is not only a supreme investigator, but understands that an interview that seems to be about gathering information is really about witnessing doubt and witnessing the role of stories, the role of storytelling in the head of the interviewee, the person being interviewed. We see it, for example, in films like The Thin Blue Line, Vernon, Florida. We see people providing information, but really in ways that are hilariously, troublingly, hauntingly shaped by these generic, second-hand, half-remembered, third-rate stories through which they understand the world and which make us what we are. And that was really a starting point for how I worked with Anwar Congo in The Act of Killing, letting people actually dramatize those stories that allow them to live with themselves and make them who they are. As a filmmaker, I really want to create an immersive experience for you. I want you to be immersed in a world rather than listening to a story being told. So I think cinema actually is a terrible medium for words. And that puts me a little bit on the edge of most documentary film, which is often very informational and word driven. I feel like cinema, and that's not to say that's bad, it's just not how I work. For me, I think what cinema is great at are silences, doubt, pauses, moments of awkwardness between people, moments when people don't believe the words they're saying. So every film I make has a different method. I'm very interested in the fact that whenever I film anybody, they start staging themselves, they start acting out the fantasies that they hold of themselves, they start acting out an idealized image of themselves, and from that you can see how they want to be seen, and you can infer the insecurities for which they're compensating. You can infer how they really see themselves. And in that sense, the nonfiction film camera in its state of nature, if you just point it at someone, becomes a prism that makes visible something that wasn't visible before. Namely, the fantasies, the stories, the lies, the images, again, often secondhand, that make us what we are, and that through which we know ourselves and the world. So instead of seeing the camera as a window, or instead of using the camera as a window to document a pre-existing reality, I try to use it as a prism to make visible actually how fiction constitutes our factual reality. In The Act of Killing, every long sequence, especially in the director's cut of The Act of Killing, every long sequence culminates in these long haunted silences, moments where we often see a single figure in kind of a ruined landscape, and these sort of surrounded. These are really moments where we are making an abrupt cut from the perspective of the perpetrators to that of the absent dead, which I hope haunt every frame of The Act of Killing. And in The Look of Silence, I deliberately, you might say if you watch the two films, they're very different formally, and they are different formally. I don't use the method of self-staging to the same degree in The Look of Silence, but I think the two films are precisely and formally complementary, because in The Look of Silence, I wanted to basically place the viewer in any of those silent tableaus that punctuate The Act of Killing, and have you feel what would it be like to be forced to rebuild a life as a survivor, surrounded by the still powerful men who killed your relatives. What would it be like to have to carry on living in the shadow of the perpetrators? And in that sense, the two films are precisely complementary, and sort of, if you could enter the silent spaces of the act of killing and make a whole film there, that's The Look of Silence. An essential part of my approach in making The Look of Silence was to think about, how do I create a kind of poem to silence? How do I show what silence looks like? How do I make you feel what silence feels like? And I had two influences, which are not really, they're filmmakers I love, but they're not filmmakers that I'm always thinking about in my work, particularly in some of my more wild work. Particularly in, for example, in The Act of Killing, I don't think I had these filmmakers at the forefront of my mind, but it's Ozu, the Japanese master, and Robert Bresson, the French master, because these are filmmakers who understand that what appears to be a calm and peaceful silence is in fact a kind of delicate equilibrium of things that can't, of contradictions and conflicts that can't be spoken. So it's just like, if I put my foot on the floor, you put your foot on the floor, it feels inert. But the reason it's inert is actually because there's a swarming of billions, trillions of subatomic particles that are repelling my foot. It's actually a complex array of forces that create an appearance of inertness. And really, in The Look of Silence, I wanted to create this sense through the close-ups, through these moments that are these awkward moments, through these impasses when Adi, a survivor, confronts the man who killed his brother and is met with a kind of wall of silence. I wanted to create this feeling of really a silent, moment of a kind of emptiness that actually is truly full and truly swarming with pain and with fear. And in that sense, that really, this sort of study of Ozu and Bresson really was a key, it was a pole star for me as I was in my approach to The Look of Silence.